Let's give ourselves a hand for being here and being gung-ho and being awake. Thank you all so much for attending. Who am I and why am I here? I'm the Admiral Stockdale of the JFK research community. My name is Alan Dale. I'm the host of an online interview program called JFK Lancer Conversations, which features one-on-one conversation with extraordinary scholars, people of consequence in the story of our unfolding efforts to come to a deeper understanding, have greater confidence that our understanding is based upon reason and knowledge. And I'm honored to be a host and your MC for the next several minutes. Depending upon how well I do, it could last throughout the entire conference. We will begin in just a moment. I should simply acknowledge that during the course of an event such as this, there will be disagreement. There will be people making claims or making statements or referring to alleged facts with which some of us will disagree, but I'm hopeful that we will abide by the idea of amicable disagreement and confine our expressions of disapproval to polite hissing and booing, and because we can do that. Before we get into the main part of our program today, which is an extraordinary program featuring the work of extraordinary scholars, I have the honor of introducing the president of the AARC. The American Association for Respiratory Care has been here for 25 years, and I'm going to read first. I'll put on my glasses. An appropriate acknowledgement of our friend Jim Lazar. Mr. Lazar is an attorney and an historical researcher. He testified before the AARB on the issue of how the term Kennedy assassination records should be defined. He has represented Jeff Morley in a 10 or perhaps even 11-year battle with the CIA over records of an intelligence officer named George Joanides, which I think culminated recently with Judge Richard Leon declaring that assassination-related records should still be kept secret because that was reasonable, according to Judge Leon. He is the president of the Assassination Archives and Research Center. He's a leader in the campaign to compel disclosure of the JFK records, which have now been kept secret fully for half a century. It's my pleasure to introduce Jim Lazar.
Thank you very much for attending. This was a first, let me begin by giving a little bit of background about the AARC. The AARC was founded in 1984 by Bud Fensterwald, Jr., Bernard Fensterwald, Jr., we know him as Bud. He was a prominent Washington, D.C. attorney and later became most famous for having written the letter on behalf of James McCord to Judge Sirica, which resulted in the opening of the Watergate scandal, the bursting of the Watergate scandal. He had, in 1969, he had left his employment on Capitol Hill as chief counsel of a Senate committee and entered private practice, and at the same time founded the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, which was a predecessor of the AARC. In 1984, he decided that a new and different organization was needed, And so he founded the Assassination Archives and Research Center, and I joined him in that effort, but he was the primary force behind the organization, and remained so until his death in 1992. The purpose of the AARC is to obtain, preserve, and disseminate information on political assassinations. We do that in a number of ways. We have gathered enormous amounts of materials from other researchers under the Freedom of Information Act, from contacts with the news media. The collection is enormous. We have over 1 million pages of, and more than 20 four-drawer file cabinets crammed with all kinds of records. After Bud's death and the technological revolution came about, we switched our focus and began digitizing records, about 1 million pages that had been obtained under the Freedom of Information Act and which later were made available under the JFK Records Act. The purpose, of course, while we are continuing, and as you will hear later this morning, we are going to renew our efforts to get information out under the Freedom of Information Act and through other means. The organization also has used conferences such as this to disseminate information and ideas that we feel worthy of consideration. The members of our board of directors are very distinguished professionals who have dedicated years of service to this organization, and many of them are speakers at this conference. This conference also has an extraordinary amount of talent assembled here to address some of the issues that are before the American people as regards the Kennedy assassination. We can't begin to cover all of them, but we will make our best efforts today to get at some of the most critical ones. Thank you.
At this time, I'm going to introduce Jerry Polikov. And Jerry is a longtime researcher, a very familiar presence, a reporter, an author. He's specialized in the role of the media in reporting on the various political assassinations. He's been published in 3 book anthologies in the New York Times, the Washington Star, the New Times, for which he covered the House Select Committee on Assassinations, broke several exclusive news stories, commented in the Village Voice, Rolling Stone, The Realist, and others. He was the first to break the story in New Times that acoustics analysis performed for the House Select Committee on Assassinations determined that shots had been fired from the front, establishing at least 2 gunmen. And he's a good guy. Allow me to introduce one of our hosts, Jerry Polikov.
Very short. I have to move the mic. I really want to thank everybody for being here today. I've been working on this conference for about, 8 months, I think, 9 months. I think I started looking for a place to hold it in January, and I never dreamed, it just took on a life of its own. And I'm so thrilled to be here today because I really thought we could put a great conference on, but I never thought we'd have Antonio Vecchiana, and and Buell Wesley Frazier, and who's never done one of these, and obviously Vesciana hasn't either. And so many people helped make all of that happen. Marie Fonzi and Tony Summers and Fernald Amandi. And, you know, when we first, I mean, it started with me kind of just asking Marie if she could ask Antonio if he would come, and and I never thought it would happen, and I don't think she did either. But this is an historic weekend. I mean, there are people here that have never done anything like this before, and they're witnesses to history, and we're going to make history this weekend, I think. First, I want to thank our media partners. We ended up having, I think, close to 20 partners, and they're in the program, I believe, and all of those things came together to just, you know, make it wonderful. And we got a little bit of a late start because we didn't have a website that was capable of really handling what we needed to do. And we didn't want to promote the conference until we did have a website, because we wanted people to be able to go and say, I'm coming. But I think we made up a lot of time, and I think, again, this is just going to be an amazing weekend. We have a lot of great panels. My own panel tomorrow, the media panel. And by the way, I want to say there have been some changes in the schedule, and we'll try to get a printout so you can see those. They all affect tomorrow. They're minor, but I want everybody to know what's what, and we'll try to get that printed up and put that out there. My topic, and we've expanded the length of our program from 45 minutes to 55 minutes, is the blurry lines between the media and the intelligence community. And as Alan said, I've specialized in the role of the media through the years, and it's not a proud one. And what I'm going to try to highlight tomorrow is so many journalists that have actually covered this case through the years, and their managers and their owners that have interlocking connections with the intelligence community. And we all hold back to Operation Mockingbird. We know that the CIA was very intent in controlling the media. And I think when you look at the Kennedy assassination, you see textbook proof that they were pretty successful. That's actually all I have to say. I want to introduce, Andrew just walked in, didn't he? Yeah. Andrew Craig, and I really want to, and by the way, I want to thank the board, everybody. Everything's swimming through my head because I'm so overwhelmed by how this thing finally came together, and it was the work of a lot of people, and the support of Jim, who bankrolled it. And
Let's give him a hand.
yes. But Andrew Craig, I met him 2 years ago in Pittsburgh, 4 years ago in Pittsburgh at Netroots Nation, when we had lunch with Cyril Wecht, and he runs the Justice Integrity Project, which is in itself very important. It performs a great role. And he's very interested in the Kennedy assassination. He's written quite a bit about that on his website in his book, Presidential Puppetry. And he asked me if he could present here, and I said he could. And the more he looked at what we were doing, the more he got excited. And he is also a media and publicity and promotional whiz. And one day he said, Jerry, I want to do the promotion and the publicity for this event. And he's done an amazing job, and I don't think we could have pulled it off without him. So I want to introduce Andrew Craig.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and all of you. And I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about what I think is one of the most important questions for this audience, and in fact, more widely throughout America. Why should anybody care about this? Now, it may seem obvious to you, but I can say that as a longtime Washington reporter and lawyer,
I run into reporters who say, well, we're covering the news. That happened 50 years ago. We've got things to cover now. I encounter relatives and friends who say, well, what can anyone do? It's the past, it's done. Well, I'd like to provide a reaction to both of those thoughts. First of all, what can anyone do? Those of you here in attendance, those watching from afar, those reading and thinking and talking about this are already doing something. We just need more of it. Most of my talk, though, is going to be why it matters, why people should want to do it, because it affects what we call the news today. Just this week, to take a couple of examples, someone jumped over the White House fence, and everyone's thinking, all these stories, the Secret Service, and maybe a shakeup or changes to restrict public access, and we're filled with this. But who's thinking about the murder of the president in broad daylight with no real accountability, despite documented many instances of irregular procedures by the Secret Service? Another thing in the news is potential war that may last many years. Congress is thinking about authorizing it. Well, the granddaddy of all of those incidents in many ways is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which rushed the United States into war in Vietnam in 1964 at great cost. And we know that President Kennedy in 1963, at a speech here in Washington, American University, planned on more peaceful coexistence. He was, in October of 1963, he issued an order indicating publicly his determination to phase down in Vietnam. So what started in 1963 was a very historic development that leads to today's news. I'd like to show right now, if I could, the thoughts of the one prosecutor who filed criminal charges in the murder of in the effort to solve this crime. This is Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney from 1961 to, I think it was 1972. And he's giving a speech here in 1967 responding to a vicious attack on NBC that was part of a really nationwide smear campaign against him for prosecuting a New Orleans businessman, Clay Shaw, on a charge of conspiracy to murder the president. And partly because of the smear, partly for other reasons, there may be reasons that one can analyze in a scholarly way the career of Jim Garrison, his prosecution, and you're going to hear more about this at the conference. But here are some lasting words that go to our question, why should we care about this? And could we please start approximately a 30-second video that I encourage all of you to read.
Of the Warren report that President Kennedy was killed by a lone assassin is a fairy tale. This does not mean that the men on the Warren Commission were aware at the time that their conclusion was totally untrue, nor does it mean necessarily that these men had any sinister motive. It does mean that the conclusion that no conspiracy existed and that Lee Oswald was the lone assassin is a fiction and a myth, and that it should be brought to an end. The people of this country don't have to be protected from the truth. This country was not built on the idea that a handful of nobles, whether located in our federal agencies in Washington, D.C., or in the news agencies in New York, should decide what was good for the people to know and what they should not know. This is a totalitarian concept which presumes that the leaders of our federal government and the men in control of the powerful press media constitute a special elite which, by virtue of their nobility and their brilliance, empower them to think for the people. Personally, I would rather put my confidence in the common sense of the people of this country. The truth about the assassination of the president has been concealed from you long enough. Those forces which are fighting so hard today to tell you that they have examined the Warren report and that everything is fine and that our investigation has uncovered nothing are not merely going to lose this fight, they have already lost it. Now let me tell you why President Kennedy was murdered and how he was murdered.
I think you want that. Well, that's what you're going to get over the next 2.5 days. And it's from a panel of 45 experts, medical doctors, lawyers, historians, and, well, I should say that he alleges, and many revelations have indicated since the Warren Commission report that there was an interlocking operation that involved intelligence agencies, Cuban exiles who wanted to overthrow Castro, mafia, bad guys. I was tempted to say triggermen, but that's too detailed. We're trying to keep this on a general plane, and you can see for yourself the details. But that's what he was talking about. And he was made to seem like a pariah, crazy talk. And younger people should understand that those of us who are a bit older remember how universal the acclaim was for the Warren Commission report. There's almost never been any political, historical document that met with such instantaneous, universal approval by virtually all of the media. Oswald did it. Oswald did it. He acted alone. He did it. End of investigation. There's a memo from the Justice Department 3 days after the killing from the number 2 person at the Justice Department to Bill Moyers, who was handling this for the new president, Lyndon Johnson. It says the most important thing is to reassure the American public on this. And it was only after that that the Warren Commission was appointed, an all-star blue ribbon panel that was supposed to be and always billed as the most thorough crime investigation in U.S. history. But we're going to see, you're going to see, that the conclusion was foreordained. It was like a prosecution on Oswald right from the beginning. And later, coming up in this event, we're going to have a special message from Oliver Stone, who did the path-breaking movie, JFK, that helped lead to, or it was part of the process that Jim Lazar was instrumental in, as so many of you have been, in releasing more and more documents. But the crown jewels are still being withheld. The secrets that are in those documents are being withheld from the American people despite the 1992 JFK Act that mandated their release. Now, those who focused on the news, just yesterday, Attorney General Eric Holder announced that he planned to resign. And there's a very predictable partisan back and forth on, did he do a good job? Well, he did, and other people say he didn't. Well, I'm a regular commentator on the major radio station in New Orleans, by coincidence, Jim Garrison's home, and they've invited me to comment later this morning on his resignation. And I'm going to go just as this is a bipartisan, nonpartisan inquiry. And what I'm going to say on WWL later this morning is that I'm going to leave it to other people, this back and forth, this partisan thing. But there are major issues of justice, integrity, including release of these documents on the JFK case that he has not addressed, none of them address. Only you and the wider audience can pressure from the bottom up. Now, I'm going to conclude now and leave it to the next part of this truly historic program with two quick thoughts. You're going to hear a lot about undercover intelligence and all of this stuff. And I don't think you people are going to be floored by it, but I can tell you that my contacts in the media, you know, they're day to day. They think this is some conspiracy. This can't be true. Well, here's two things for them. Anyone who uses that term conspiracy should admit that the source of that talk is a CIA memo in April 1967 to attack Jim Garrison. And they asked all of their contacts in the media to use the term conspiracy theory. And this is partly what Jerry is going to be talking about at the media panel. And they still use it, as evidenced by this week's big Washington Post story about this event. It's all conspiracy. And who are the legitimate critics? Well, they picked, those who wrote it, and Lyndon Johnson as the legitimate critics, but it turns out the criticism isn't really of substance. Well, you heard Jim Garrison accurately describe that there are huge holes in it. For one thing, tomorrow you're going to see actors reading from a secret transcript where the Warren Commission found out that Oswald was a paid FBI informant. And Allen Dulles, who President Kennedy had forced out of office in 1961, took the lead in this, you're going to see, and how to handle this, because it didn't fit their lone nut conclusion. If Oswald, a former Marine with a high-level security clearance, was shown to be an asset, not just of the FBI, but of other agencies. So that's a bit of prediction, and here's how a little bit of just a tiny bit of my own background. I'm focused on current affairs, so I approach this backwards, just like I hope a lot of listeners do, to understand current affairs by understanding our past. And I highly recommend that. And in my own researches on current news stories, I saw often there's a hidden component that doesn't fit the law. It doesn't fit journalism. What is it? Quite often it's national intelligence. And often for good motives. I reveal in my book, Presidential Puppetry, that my mother, who was quite famous in her day, author and investigative reporter, was actually a secret CIA operative. So it's the same thing as Clay Shaw. It's the same thing as James Bond. If you look at the movies, he didn't say, I'm a British spy. He said, I work in the import-export business. That's exactly what Clay Shaw was doing in Valerie Flame, because nobody's going to ask questions. It sounds kind of boring, right? Imports, exports. But it allows you to do all kinds of international things. Finally, in conclusion, here's why this is a unique week in American history and a unique conference, and congratulations for being here. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the killing. And while that should be justly memorialized, there were a lot of kind of conflicting messages. Well, the loss of the great president, where were you? The legacy. But very little emphasis on the evidence. Who did it and why? And this year, it's the 50th anniversary of the report on the evidence. There'll never be another 50th, particularly when there are people alive who were from that era, who can talk authoritatively like they're doing at this conference. So this is unique. It's the last chance, really, for a big anniversary to look into this and understand why it's important to you, to history, and to our entire country. Thank you very much.
I had been asked to also speak on the issue of why this conference matters. The issue is actually broader than that. It is why the assassination of President Kennedy matters. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that this conference has been made possible because of a substantial donation by Abby Rockefeller. Abby, we all thank you very much. In speaking with Abby Rockefeller, she told me that she had been convinced that despite the passage of time, the issue was still of great importance because she had recently read Jim Douglas's book, The Unspeakable, and which, in my opinion, is the best. It's almost unique in the sense that very few works have tried to go into that issue. We have focused on trying to prove there was more than one assassin or what were the forces behind the assassination. But on the issue of why it matters, Jim Douglas' book is of great importance, regardless of whether or not you agree with it in part or in whole. It's important to be aware of it. And Abby asked me if we were going to invite Jim Douglas. She hoped that we would. I said that we had tried, but that unfortunately his writing commitments prohibited it. This conference matters because for several reasons. One, of course, is that over the past several decades, since the issuance of the Warren Report, there has been a profound decline in trust in government and in the press. That has affected American life tremendously. In addition to the JFK assassination, we had in the 1960s a trifecta of political assassinations: Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy, that profoundly shifted the political power in the United States, the political spectrum. The liberal left part of the spectrum was wiped out, and the devastating consequences of that still follow us today. And in my view, they will follow us until we finally come to grips with the Kennedy assassination and address it as we need to. Now, in a sense, it's a bit surprising that we should need to address it at all, because we were promised in 1992, Congress enacted the JFK, the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, for short, the JFK Act. And that act mandated the release of all records related to the Kennedy assassination promptly. the act had been caused by, in large part, by Oliver Stone's movie JFK and a tagline on that movie which had been suggested by a Kennedy assassination researcher and at one time a member of the AARC's board of directors, Kevin Walsh. Walsh had suggested that to Stone that he insert a tagline saying that the records were being withheld until 2039. That caused an enormous public outpouring. I've been told that it was the largest public outcry to Congress that there had ever been to that date. And it resulted in the JFK Act, which Congress unanimously passed, specifying that all records should be promptly released. That hasn't happened. The Assassination Records Review Board, which was the enforcement arm of the JFK Act, did a remarkable job in getting released many thousands of documents that had been previously withheld by various federal government agencies. However, it also had some flaws, and one of them is that since the review board went out of existence in 1998, there is no enforcement arm to see that records continue to be disclosed. The CIA at present is withholding thousands of pages of documents in their entirety, and more in part, refusing to release them until at least 2017. And it's uncertain what will occur in 2017. This, frankly, is an outrage. The founding fathers of this country were profoundly interested in history and its impact, and they understood that in order to be their own governors, a people must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. We have been deprived and are being deprived of that power, so we don't know. We were told that the JFK Act would enable us to reach our own conclusions about what happened, but we don't know substantial parts of that question because of the continued withholding by the CIA and the National Archives. The National Archives' role in this is particularly disturbing. Its mission is to release records to the public, to get access to historical records to the public. And the public has demonstrated again and again that the subject that people are most interested in is the Kennedy assassination. Yet the archives continues to withhold those records, and it does so at the behest of its sister agency, the CIA. The National Archives is not supposed to be a burial ground for records. It is supposed to make them public. It hasn't. One of the issues that needs to be addressed at this conference is how to get the records released. We've made, over the past several years, there's been a concerted campaign led by myself and other supporters to try and get these records released. The National Archives in 2010 actually said in response to questions that I posed at a public forum that the records would be released by the end of 2013 because under an executive order issued by President Obama, some 400 million pages of historical records were supposed to be released by the end of 2013. Deputy Archivist Michael Kurtz said that that would happen, that the JFK Act records would be included in those releases. The following year, however, the National Archives reneged on its promise, and it has continued to oppose release of the records since then. I sent a letter to the National Archivist requesting that inviting him to appear at this conference to address the issue of the withholding of these records. Through a spokesman who telephoned me one day, he declined to do that. Now, the conference matters with respect to the functioning of the JFK Act law. There has been no congressional oversight of that legislation. The JFK Act was novel. It was the most liberal disclosure information act ever passed. Yet Congress has not looked into either what went right with it or what went wrong with it. It is time that there was congressional oversight of the functioning of the JFK Act and the Assassination Records Review Board. What we have learned under the Freedom of Information Act and through the investigative efforts of reporter Jefferson Morley, who became my client in the effort to get records on George Joannides, reveals a further need for Congress to become involved in this issue. What was established as a result of that lawsuit and the work of Jefferson Morley was that the last official investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy was subverted by an agency that itself was the focus of the congressional investigative efforts. This strikes directly at the principle of democratic accountability. There is the hallmark of democratic accountability is the power of Congress to investigate wrongdoing by executive agencies. That has not occurred with respect to what we now know, that the case officer for the DRE, George Joannides, was brought out of retirement to work in an undercover capacity as liaison with the House Select Committee on assassinations. They were pursuing the obviously important issue of Oswald's relationship to the DRE, because Oswald had been involved in activities prior to the assassination, which were connected to the DRE. And neither Joannides nor the CIA ever informed the Congressional Committee that Joannides was the case officer they were looking for. And they stonewalled request for information about DRE and Oswald. This is not a dead issue. The issue has been raised recently by the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into CIA's torture policy and practices. And it has been disclosed, and the CIA has now admitted that its staff lied to Congress and interfered with the investigation of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It is a sign of some very cautious optimism that at last a Senate committee has begun to look critically at the activities of the CIA with respect to a congressional oversight committee. However, as Nancy Pelosi was recently quoted as saying, Congress is afraid of the CIA. Now, that is absolutely devastating. There can be no democratic accountability if Congress is afraid of an agency that it should be investigating. We need to get that issue raised again in connection with the failure with the CIA's activities regarding the investigation by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. This topic will be explored very shortly by Dan Hardway and Eddie Lopez and Professor G. Robert Blakey, who were staff members, or in the case of Blakey, the chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It's an issue that deserves the closest attention. Thank you very much.
Before we continue, I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgments. The first is I've noticed that Lisa Peace is freezing. So anyone with a flask or perhaps some coffee should find their way to Ms. Peace, and I know that will be much appreciated. Someone left a sweater in the executive suite. It's pink. I believe it belongs to Bill Simpich. Yes? Say this again? It may be available. Mr. Lazar just referred to a couple of things that I think are worthy of comment, especially in the context of the people who are in this room. Because imitation is the sincerest form of plagiarism, I will say that this may be the greatest gathering of intelligence and talent ever assembled in one place, with the possible exception of when JFK dined alone. Jim referred to the National Archives and the problems associated with having access, gaining permission, finding the materials that we are theoretically entitled to. I would tell you that in the room is probably, certainly, a most distinguished scholar and a supremely influential person behind the scenes, my friend Malcolm Blunt, who's over here. Malcolm, we should give Malcolm a hand. Malcolm will tell us quite a lot on Sunday at, I think, 10 a.m. that even with permission and even with the action on his behalf, make it personal, when you know the right people to act on your behalf, still doesn't mean you're going to get what you're seeking, you know. The other thing I think I would like to refer to is that with regard to the success and the immeasurable impact of Oliver Stone's film, JFK, there's a person in the room who played an influential role in the content of particular parts of the film. and without whom I think the film might not have been as impactful, and his name is Dr. John Newman, and he's in the corner over here, and we should thank him. I have very brief remarks prepared, which I will read, and I'm sure it will be very impressive. The devil is in the details, and anyone with an interest in studying President Kennedy's assassination will find details in numbers and on a scale of varying magnitudes that might easily overwhelm. The collection and chain of possession of evidence from 3 crime scenes, the medical evidence associated with Parkland Hospital, the security preparations and performance of duties by the Dallas Police, the Secret Service, the President's military autopsy and the records of that event, Lee Harvey Oswald's strange history, Russia, Castro, New Orleans, Mexico City, the CIA, the FBI, the Warren Commission, and that's only up through 1964. Hundreds of names, thousands of alleged facts, millions upon millions of words competing for our attention and requiring our necessary judgment. Is this important? Is this true? More than 50 years later, details relating to the death of President Kennedy have accumulated like snowflakes in a blizzard. So many different pieces of so many different puzzles, and no instructions about how they might ultimately fit together, except through our own diligence and reflection. Speaking before Princeton University's graduating class of 1954 in an address titled "The Educated Citizen," Illinois Governor Adlai Eve Stevenson said this: "We in our country have indeed placed all of our faith, all of our hopes upon the education, the intelligence, and the understanding of our people. We have said that ours is a government conducted by its citizens, and from this it follows that the government will be better conducted if its citizens are educated. It's as simple as that. We believe that the people will find their way to the right solution, given sufficient information." Governor Stevenson concluded, "We believe with Lincoln, why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate judgment of the people?" Nearly 10 years later, on November 29, 1963, President Johnson announced the creation of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, which would forever be known as the Warren Commission. Its final report, presented to the President on November 24, 1964, made public 3 days later, declared that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in the attack which resulted in the death of President Kennedy and the wounding of Texas Governor John Connally, and that Jack Ruby had acted alone in murdering Oswald. So our topic for the next couple of days is criticism. Winston Churchill said, "Criticism may not be agreeable, but it is necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention to an unhealthy state of things." Warren Commission member and future President Gerald Ford described the report by claiming, "The monumental record of the President's Commission will stand like a Gibraltar of factual literature through the ages to come." 30 years later, after an ocean of dissent and criticism of the official findings, Norman Mailer compared the Commission's work to a dead whale decomposing on a beach. The late Harold Weisberg quoted Warren Commission member Senator Richard Russell as saying very simply, "We have not been told the truth about Oswald." In 1998, in a chapter titled "The Problem of Secrecy and the Solution of the JFK Act," the Assassination Records Review Board, which was created to collect and review the documents relating to the assassination, pointed out in its final report, doubts about the Warren Commission's findings were not restricted to ordinary citizens. Well before 1978, President Johnson, Robert Kennedy, at least 4 of the 7 members of the Warren Commission all articulated, if sometimes off the record, some level of skepticism about the Commission's basic findings. And today, in the year 2014, a majority of Americans share that skepticism. We are going to take a brief intermission. When we return, so this is sort of the second inning break. So those of you who have lost feeling in your legs because you're freezing, you should stand up and give yourselves another hand for being with us. Thank you so much for caring enough to put your money where your mouth is. We'll be back in just a few moments.